Well, slavery's been going on for thousands and thousands of years. It's nothing new. The idea of Europeans being enslaved is again as old as Europe. In the case of Europeans finding themselves enslaved in the medieval period, during the same time of the Moors, that was also quite common. It was the Moors and other Asiatic and African peoples would capture Europeans off the coasts of places like Denmark, Britain, France, Spain, Italy, Greece, and they would sell them in the markets of Africa and the Near East. They sold them ultimately not by the thousands, they sold them by the millions. John Blassingame, historian, talks about the enslavement of Europeans and how, again, it was done by angry Muslims who were remembering what happened to them under Catholic domination. Talks about how the Spanish, the Italians, the Portuguese were the primary victims. We lost our property. We were thrown out of Spain. So the resentment for the Catholic authorities of Spain would certainly have been great. And the desire to go and to fight and to enslave and hurt those who hurt you would be make a lot more sense under those conditions. And there are many references to Europeans being sold in the markets in Salé, in Ceuta, in Tangier, Tripoli, and various other parts of the coastal regions of Africa. And also sold somewhat in the interior. Africans, though, and African Muslims tended not to purchase slaves for purposes of setting up a system, economic system, predicated on slave labor. How, ironically, Africans treated the enslaved Europeans better than the Arab Muslims did. Africans, for example, traditionally enslaved people who were prisoners of war, criminals, debtors, orphans, or wards. And the idea of being a slave meant that I owned your labor. I didn't own you physically. I could make you work, but I could not argue your non-humanity. Nor could I tell you you can't wear the clothes that you're accustomed to wearing in your culture. Nor could I really justifiably tell you you can't wear, you can't speak your language, which speaks again about the humanity and clearly an issue of anger. The difference is that the emphasis in the historical tradition of the West is now on focusing on the last great enslavement, which was the enslavement of African peoples. The Arabs also, of course, coming from Saudi Arabia, sold Africans, sold Europeans, and sold each other. Every people have engaged in the enslavement of other people for the purpose of profit. Greed goes across ethnic and cultural lines. Insensitivity goes across ethnic and cultural lines. It didn't make any difference. No nation on the earth has escaped the enslavement of at least some of its people. The only thing that I maintain is that the difference in the system of slavery is what needs to be noted. And custom has often produced slavery after war. You take your captive and then you put him to work. Now, how people treat the captive is more revealing, I think, than just the idea of having slavery at all.
Arabs convinced the local black populations to join in the struggle against a common oppressor. They also convinced many of them to abandon their traditional beliefs and pledge their allegiance to Allah.
The Africans assumed that by supporting the Arabs would get the Romans literally off their back. They were right. The Arabs did get the Romans off their back, but the Arabs replaced the Romans on their back. And like most conquerors, they declared war on African culture and African ways of life. The Arab has always been a propagator and a defender of slavery. They've always rationalized slavery based on Islam. I do not think any religion sanctions slavery. And anytime you use a religion to sanction slavery, you're misusing that religion and misusing the Word of God. Well, the Christians did it, and the Arabs have done it, and the Hebrews have done it. It's not right in any case.
And I've heard, of course, Dr. Clark talk about that before, is we're assuming again that Africa had no tradition of slavery prior to the religion of Islam. And that's not true. So slavery existed before there was someone called a Muslim. What Islam does do is it does create a kind of third party, so to speak, whose agenda is now to look out for the third party interests. The same can be true, or is true of any group which gets power. The Ashanti are involved in the enslavement of other Africans. The kingdom of Dahomey is probably one of the greatest enslavers of all African kingdoms. These are people who did enslave others because they didn't see any connection between themselves and the other group. It didn't have to do with the religion of Islam. It had to do with them not seeing a connection, period. Islam's presence represents, as I said, a kind of third party which tries to consolidate people around this notion of, one God, and God sends prophets. That's really not different from a lot of other traditional African faiths. The Yoruba talk about Olodumare as one God, and yet there are different orishas or gods, mini-gods, if you will, that exist within it. The problem is that most people were not looking at the cosmological links or the parallels. They were simply manifesting a very simplistic understanding of their faith. And they did it at a time that was very difficult. It is more complicated than just saying that it was the fault of the Muslims who were part of the enslavement trade. The Muslims are part of the enslavement trade just as traditional African faiths were part of the enslavement trade. To me, it's ridiculous. And with all due respect, and I'm not saying Dr. Clark was ridiculous, but I think it's ridiculous if we think that it's very simple to just say this was the result of the Muslim presence. Did the Muslims contribute? Yes, they did. Did other individual African peoples contribute because they had their own provincial interests? Yes, they did. So it's not a case of saying that the Muslims did something that others hadn't already done. The only difference is because Islam was a religion that crosses ethnic lines, it becomes, it's bigger. You generally didn't have a Hausa becoming Yoruba, right? You generally didn't have Igbo becoming Hausa, or Ashanti becoming Kikuyu. What I'm saying is those were your ethnic roots with your own culture, your own spiritual practice. Islam is different because it's unifying different ethnicities under the banner of one faith, which then means that this faith is going to act out its own interests as a faith. So Africans were doing what Africans had always done, serve their own interests, unless what? Unless they were more conscientious about what the result was of their actions.